Hello, guys. Welcome to Side Minds. We are reading Veronica Decides to Die by Paulo Coelho. If you have not subscribed yet to the channel, do subscribe, like, and share if you like the content. We are on page 48. Veronica watched the woman, still smiling, being strapped to the bed. Tell her what is going on, said Zetka, to the male nurse. Otherwise, she'll be frightened. He turned and showed Veronica the syringe. He seemed pleased to be treated like a doctor, explaining to a younger doctor the correct procedures and the proper treatments. This syringe contains a dose of insulin, he said, speaking in a grave, technical tone of voice. It's used by diabetics to combat high glucose. However, when the dose is much larger than normal, the consequent drop in blood glucose provokes a state of coma. He tapped the needle lightly to get rid of any air and then stuck it in a vein in Zetka's foot. That's what is going to happen now. She's going to enter a state of induced coma. Don't be frightened if her eyes glaze and don't expect her to recognize you when she's under the effects of the medication. That's awful, inhuman, Veronica said. People struggle to get out of a coma, not to go into one. People struggle to live, not to commit suicide, replied the nurse. But Veronica ignored the remark. And a state of coma allows the organism to rest. Its functions are all drastically reduced and any existing tension disappears. He continued to inject the liquid while he was talking, and Zetka's eyes were growing dull. Don't worry, Veronica was saying to her. You're absolutely normal. The story you told me about the king? Don't waste your time. She can't hear you anymore. The woman on the bed, who a few minutes before had seemed so lucid and full of life, now had her eyes fixed on some point in the distance, and liquid was bubbling from one corner of her mouth. What did you do? She shouted at the nurse. Just my job. Veronica started calling to Zetka, shouting, threatening that she would go to the police, the press, the human rights organizations. Calm down. You may be in a mental hospital, but you still have to abide by certain rules. She saw that the man was utterly serious and she was afraid. But since she had nothing to lose, she went on shouting. From where she was, Zetka could see the ward and the beds all empty except for one, to which her body was strapped, and besides which a girl was standing, staring in horror. The girl didn't know that the person in the bed was still alive with all her biological functions working perfectly, but that her soul was flying, almost touching the ceiling, experiencing a sense of profound peace. Zetka was making an astral journey, something that had been a surprise during her first experience of insulin shock. She hadn't mentioned it to anyone. She was only there to be cured of depression, and as soon as she was in a fit state, she hoped to leave that place forever. If she started telling them that she had left her body, they would think she was crazier than when she had entered Villet. However, as soon as she had returned to her body, she began reading up on both subjects, insulin shock and the strange feeling of floating in space. There wasn't much written about the treatment. It had been used for the first time around 1930 but had been completely banned in psychiatric hospitals because of the possibility of irreversible damage to the patient. During one such session, she had visited Dr. Igor's office in her astral form at precisely the moment when he was discussing the subject with one of the owners of the hospital. It's a crime, Dr. Igor was saying. Yes, but it's cheap and it's quick, replied the other man. Anyway, who's interested in the rights of the insane? No one is going to complain. Even so, some doctors still considered it a quick way of treating depression. Zetka had sought out and borrowed everything that had been written about insulin shock, especially first-hand reports by patients who had experienced it. The story was always the same: horrors and more horrors. Not one of them had experienced anything resembling what she was living through at that moment. She concluded, quite rightly, that there was no relationship between insulin and the feeling that her consciousness was leaving her body. On the contrary, the tendency with that kind of treatment was to diminish the patient's mental capacity. She started researching the existence of the soul, read a few books on occultism, And then one day she stumbled on a vast literature that described exactly what she was experiencing. It was called astral travel, and many people had already had the same experience. Some had merely set out to describe what they had felt, while others had developed techniques to provoke it. Zetka now knew that those techniques by heart, and she used them every night to go wherever she wished. The description of those experiences and visions varied, but they all had certain points in common. The strange, irritating noise that preceded the separation of the body from the spirit, followed by a shock, a rapid loss of consciousness, and then the peace and joy of floating in the air, attached to the body by a silvery cord and a cord that could be stretched indefinitely, although there were legends in books, of course, that said the person could die if they allowed that silver thread to break. Her experience, however, showed that she could go as far as she wanted and the cord never broke. But generally speaking, the books had been very useful in teaching her how to get more and more out of her astral traveling. She had learned, for example, that when she wanted to move from one place to another, she had to concentrate on projecting herself into space, imagining exactly where she wanted to go. Unlike the routes followed by planes, which leave from one place and fly the necessary distance to reach another, an astral journey was made through mysterious tunnels. You imagine yourself in a place, you entered the appropriate tunnel at a terrifying speed, and the other place would appear. It was through books, too, that she had lost her fear of the creatures inhabiting space. Today, there was no one else in the world. The first time she had left her body, however, she had found a lot of people watching her, amused by her look of surprise. Her first reaction was to assume that there were dead people, ghosts haunting the hospital. Then, with the help of book and of her own experience, she realized that although there were a few disembodied spirits wandering about there, among them were people as alive as she was, who had either developed the technique of leaving their bodies or who were not even aware of what was happening to them because in some other part of the world they were sleeping deeply while their spirits roamed freely abroad. Today, knowing that this was her last astral journey on insulin because she had just been to visit Dr. Igor's office and overheard him saying he was ready to release her, she decided to remain inside Willet. From the moment she went out through the main gate, she would never again return, not even in spirit, and she wanted to say goodbye. To say goodbye, that was the really difficult part. Once in a mental hospital, a person grows used to the freedom that exists in the world of insanity and becomes addicted to it. You no longer have to take on responsibilities, to struggle to earn your daily bread, to be bothered with repetitive, mundane tasks. You could spend hours looking at a picture and making absurd doodles. Everything is tolerated because, after all, the person is mentally ill. As she herself had the occasion to observe, most of the inmates showed a marked improvement once they entered the hospital. They no longer had to hide their symptoms, and the family atmosphere helped them to accept their own neurosis and psychosis. At the beginning, Zetka had been fascinated by Willett and had even considered joining the fraternity once she was cured. But she realized that if she was sensible, she could continue doing everything she enjoyed doing outside as long as she dealt with the challenges of daily life. As someone had said, all you had to do was to keep your insanity under control. You could cry, get worried, or angry like any other normal human being, as long as you remembered that up above your spirit was laughing out loud at all those thorny situations. She would soon be back home with her children and her husband, and that part of her life also had its charms. Of course, it would be difficult to find work. After all, in a small town like Jublajana, news travels fast, and her internment in Villet was already common knowledge to many people. But her husband earned enough to keep the family, and she could use her free time to continue making her astral journeys, though not under the dangerous influence of insulin. There were only one thing she did not want to experience again. The reason that had brought her to Willet: depression. The doctors said that a recently discovered substance, serotonin, was one of the compounds responsible for how human beings felt. A lack of serotonin impaired one's capacity to concentrate at work, to sleep, to eat, and to enjoy life's pleasures. When this substance was completely absent, the person experienced despair, pessimism, a sense of futility, terrible tiredness, anxiety, difficulties in making decisions, and would end up sinking into permanent gloom, which would lead either to complete apathy and or to suicide. Other more conservative doctors said that any drastic change in life could trigger depression. Moving to another country, losing a loved one, divorce, an increase in the demands of work or family. Some modern studies, based on the number of internments in winter and summer, pointed to the lack of sunlight as one of the causes of depression. In Zetka's case, however, the reason was simpler than anyone suspected. There was a man hidden in her past, or rather, the fantasy she had built up about a man she had known a long time ago. It was so stupid, plunging into depression and insanity, all because of a man whose current whereabouts she didn't even know, but with whom she had fallen hopelessly in love in her youth since. Like every normal young girl, Zetka had needed to experience the impossible love. However, unlike her friends who only dreamed of the impossible love, Zetka had decided to go further. She had actually tried to realize that dream. He lived on the other side of the ocean and she sold everything to go and join him. He was married, but she accepted her role as mistress, plotting secretly to make him her husband. He barely had enough time for himself, but she resigned herself to spending days and night in a cheap hotel, waiting for his rare telephone calls. Despite her determination to put up with everything in the name of love, the relationship did not work out. He never said anything directly, but one day Zetka realized that she was no longer welcome and she returned to Slovenia. She spent a few months barely eating and remembering every second they had spent together, reviewing again and again their moments of joy and pleasure in bed, trying to fix on something that would allow her to believe in the future of that relationship. Her friends were worried about the state she was in, but something in Zetka's heart told her that it was just a passing phase. Personal growth has its price, and she was paying it without complaint. And so it was. One morning she woke up with an immense will to live. For the first time in ages, she ate heartily and then went out and found a job. She found not only a job but also the attention of a handsome, intelligent young man, much sought after by the other women. A year later, she was married to him. She aroused both the envy and the applause of her girlfriends. The two of them went on to live in a comfortable house with a garden that looked over the river that flows through Jublajana. They had children and took trips to Austria or Italy during the summer. When Slovenia decided to separate from Yugoslavia, he was drafted into army. Zetka was Serb, that is, the enemy, and her life seemed on the point of collapse. In the 10 days that followed, with the troops prepared for confrontation and no one knowing quite what the result of the Declaration of Independence would be and how much blood would have to be spilled because of it, Zetka realized how much she loved him. She spent the whole time praying to God, who until then had seemed remote, but who now seemed her only hope. She promised the saints and angels anything as long as she could have her husband back. And so it was. He came back. The children were able to go to school where they taught the Slovene language, and the threat of war shifted to the neighboring Republic of Croatia. 3 years had passed. Yugoslavia's war with Croatia moved to Bosnia, and remote reports began to circulate of massacres committed by the Serbs. Zetka thought it unjust to label a whole nation as criminal because of the folly of a few madmen. Her life took on a meaning she had never expected. She defended her people with pride and courage, writing in newspapers, appearing on television, organizing conferences. None of this bore any fruit, and even today, foreigners still believe all the Serbs were responsible for those atrocities. But Zetka knew she had done her duty, and that she could not abandon her brothers and sisters at such a difficult time. She could count on the support of her Slovene husband, of her children, and of people who were not manipulated by the propaganda machines of either side. One evening, she walked past the statue of Prešeren, the great Slovene poet, and she began to think about his life. When he was 34, he went into a church and saw an adolescent girl, Julia Primic, with whom he fell passionately in love. Like the ancient minstrels, he began to write her poems in the hope of one day marrying her. It turned out that Julia was the daughter of an upper middle class family, and apart from the chance sighting inside the church, Presseren never again managed to get near her. But that encounter inspired his finest poetries and created a whole legend around his name. In the small central square of Jublajana, the statue of the poet stares fixedly at something. If you follow his gaze, you will see on the other side of the square the face of a woman carved into the stone of one of the houses. That was where Julia had lived. Even after death, Presseren gazes for all eternity on his impossible love. And what if he had fought a little harder? Zetka's heart started beating fast. Perhaps it was a presentiment of something bad, an accident involving one of her children. She raced back home only to find them watching television and eating popcorn. The sadness, however, did not pass. Zetka lay down and slept for nearly 12 hours, and when she woke, she didn't feel like getting up. President's story had brought back to her the image of a lost lover who had never again contacted her. And Zetka asked herself, did I fight hard enough? Should I have accepted my role as mistress rather than wanting things to go as I expected them to? Did I fight for my first love with the same energy with which I fought for my people? Zetka persuaded herself that she had, but the sadness would not go away. What once had seemed to her a paradise, the house near the river, the husband whom she loved, the children eating popcorn in front of the television, was gradually transformed into a hell. Today, after many astral journeys and many encounters with highly evolved beings, Zetka knew that this was all nonsense. She had used her impossible love as an excuse, a pretext for breaking the ties with the life she had led, which was far from being the life she really expected for herself. But 12 months earlier, the situation had been quite different. She began frantically looking for the distant lover. She spent a fortune on international phone calls, but he no longer lived in the same city. It was impossible to find him. She sent letters by express mail, which were always returned. She found all his friends, but no one had any idea of what had happened to him. Her husband was completely unaware of what was going on, and that infuriated her because he should at least have suspected something, made a scene, complained, threatened to put her out in the street. She became convinced that the international phone call operators, the postman, and all her girlfriends had been bribed by him to pretend indifference. She sold the jewelry that had been given to her when she married and brought a plane ticket to the other side of the ocean until someone managed to convince her that America was a very large place and there was no point going there if you didn't know quite what you were looking for. One evening, she lay down, suffering for love, as she had never suffered before, not even when she had come back to the awful day to day life of Jublajana. She spent that night and the following 2 days in her room. On the third day, her husband, so kind, so concerned about her, called the doctor. Did he really not know that Zetka was trying to get in touch with the other man, to commit adultery, to exchange her life as a respected wife for life as someone's secret mistress, to leave Jublajana, her home, her children, forever? The doctor arrived. She became hysterical and locked the door, only opening it again when the doctor had left. A week later, she no longer had sufficient strength or will to get out of bed and began to use the bed as toilet. She did not think anymore. Her head was completely taken up by fragmentary memories of the man who she was convinced was also unsuccessfully looking for her. Her infuriating, generous husband changed the sheets, smoothed her hairs, said that it would be all right in the end. The children no longer came into her bedroom, not since she had slapped one of them for no reason, and then knelt down, kissed his feet, begging forgiveness, tearing her nightgown into shreds in order to show her despair and repentance. After another week in which she spat out the food offered to her, drifted in and out of reality several times, spent whole nights awake and whole days asleep, two men came into her room without knocking. One of them held her down while the other gave her an injection, and she woke up invalid. Depression, she heard the doctor say to her husband. Sometimes it's provoked by the most banal things. For example, the lack of a chemical substance, serotonin, in the organism. From the ceiling in the ward, Zetka watched the nurse approaching. Syringe in hand, the girl was still standing there trying to talk to her body, terrified by her vacant gaze. For some moments, Zetka considered the possibility of telling her about everything that was happening. But then she changed her mind. People never learn anything by being told, they have to find out for themselves. The nurse placed the needle in Zetka's arms and injected her with glucose. As if grabbed by an enormous arm, her spirit left the ceiling, sped through a dark tunnel, and returned to her body. Hello, Veronica. The girl looked frightened. Are you alright? Yes, I'm fine. Fortunately, I've managed to survive this dangerous treatment, but it won't be repeated. How do you know? Here, no one respects the patient's wishes. Zetka knew because during her astral journey she had gone to Dr. Igor's office. I can't explain why, I just know. Do you remember the first question I ever asked you? Yes, you asked me if I knew what being crazy meant. Exactly. This time I'm not going to tell you a story, I'll just say that insanity is the inability to communicate your ideas. It's as if you were in a foreign country, able to see and understand everything that is going on around you, but incapable of explaining what you need to know or of being helped because you don't understand the language they speak there. We have all felt that. And all of us, one way or another, are insane. Outside the barred window, the sky was thick with stars, and the moon, in its first quarter, was rising behind the mountains. Poets loved the full moon. They wrote thousands of poems about it, but it was the new moon that Veronica loved best because there was still room for it to grow, to expand, to fill the whole of its surface with light before its inevitable decline. That night, she felt like going over to the piano in the living room and celebrating that night with a lovely sonata she had learned at school. Looking up at the sky, she had an indescribable sense of well being, as if the infinite nature of the universe had revealed her own eternity to her. She was separated, however, from her desire by a steel door, and a woman was always endlessly reading a book. Besides, no one played the piano at that hour of night. She would wake up the whole neighborhood. Veronica laughed. The neighborhood were the wards full of crazy people, and those crazy people were in turn full of drugs to make them sleep. Her sense of well being continued, though. She got up and went over to Zetka's bed, but she was sound asleep too, perhaps recovering from the horrible experience she had been through. Go back to bed, said the nurse. Good girls should be dreaming of angels or lovers. Don't treat me like a child. I'm not some tame mad woman who's afraid of everything. I'm raving, hysterical. I don't even respect my own life or the lives of others. Anyway, today I feel more vigilant. I have looked at the moon and I need to talk to someone. The nurse looked at her, surprised by her reaction. Are you afraid of me? Asked Veronica. In a couple of days' time, I'll be dead. What have I got to lose? Why don't you go for a walk, dear, and let me finish my book? Because this is a prison, and there's prison warden pretending to read a book just to make others think she's an intelligent woman. The fact is, though, that she's watching every movement in the ward, and she guards the keys to the door as if they were a treasure. It's all in the regulations, and so she must obey them. That way, she can pretend to have an authority she doesn't have in her everyday life with her husband and children. Veronica was trembling without quite knowing why. Keys? Said the nurse. The door is always open. You don't think I would stay locked up in here with a load of mental patients, do you? What does she mean? The door's open. A few days ago, I wanted to get out of here, and this woman even went with me to the toilet. What is she talking about? Don't take me too seriously, said the nurse. The fact is, we don't need a lot of security here because of the sedatives we dole out. You are shivering. Are you cold? I don't know. I think it must be something to do with my heart. If you like, you can go for a walk. What I would really like is to play the piano. The living room is quite separate, so your piano playing won't disturb anyone. Do what you like. Veronica's trembling changed into low, timid, suppressed sobs. She knelt down, laid her head on the woman's lap, and cried and cried. The nurse put down the book and stroked Veronica's hair, allowing that wave of sadness and tears into its natural expression. There they sat for almost half an hour, one crying, the other consoling, though neither knew why or what. The sobbing finally ceased. The nurse helped her up, took her by the arm, and led her to the door. I've got a daughter your age. when you were first admitted, full of drips and tubes. I kept wondering why a pretty young girl with her whole life ahead of her should want to kill herself. Then all kinds of rumors started flying around about the letter that you left behind, which I never believed could be the real motive, and how you didn't have long to live because of some incurable heart problem. I couldn't get the image of my own daughter out of my head. What if she decided to do something like that? Why do certain people try to go against the natural order of things, which is to fight for survival whatever happens? That's why I was crying, said Veronica. When I took the pills, I wanted to kill someone I hated. I didn't know that other Veronicas existed inside me, Veronicas that I could love. What makes a person hate themselves? Cowardice, perhaps, or the eternal fear of being wrong, of not doing what others expect. A few moments ago, I was happy. I forgot I was under sentence of death. Then, when I remembered the situation I am in, I felt frightened. The nurse opened the door and Veronica went out. How could she ask me that? What does she want? To understand why I was crying? Doesn't she realize I'm a perfectly normal person with the same desires and fears as everyone else? And that a question like that, now that it's all too late, could throw me into panic? As she was walking down the corridors, lit by the same faint light as in the ward, Veronica realized that it was too late. She could no longer control her fear. I must get a grip on myself. I'm kind of person who sticks to any decision she makes, who always sees things through. It's true that in her life she had seen many things through to this ultimate consequence, but they're only unimportant things like prolonging a quarrel that could easily have been resolved with an apology, or not phoning a man she was in love with simply because she thought the relationship would lead nowhere. She was intransigent about the easy things, as if trying to prove to herself how strong and indifferent she was, when in fact she was just a fragile woman who had never been an outstanding student, never excelled at school sports, and had never succeeded in keeping the peace at home. She had overcome her minor defects only to be defeated by matters of fundamental importance. She had managed to appear utterly independent when she was, in fact, desperately in need for company. When she entered a room, everyone would turn to look at her, but she almost always ended the night alone in the convent, watching a TV that she hadn't even bothered to have properly tuned. She gave all her friends the impression that she was a woman to be envied, and she expended most of her energy in trying to behave in accordance with the image she had created of herself. Because of that, she had never had enough energy to be herself. A person who, like everyone else in the world, needed other people in order to be happy. But other people who were so difficult, they reacted in unpredictable ways. They surrounded themselves with defensive walls. They behaved just as she did, pretending they didn't care about anything. When someone more open to life appeared, they either rejected them outright or made them suffer, consigning them to being inferior, ingenuous. She might have impressed a lot of people with her strength and determination, but where had it left her? In the void, utterly alone, in Villette, in the anteroom of death. Veronica's remorse over her attempted suicide resurfaced and she firmly pushed it away. Now she was feeling something she had never allowed herself to feel: hatred. Hatred, something almost as physical as walls, pianos, or nurses. She could almost touch the destructive energy leaking out of her body. She allowed the feeling to emerge regardless of whether it was good or bad. She was sick of self control, of masks, of appropriate behavior. Veronica wanted to spend her remaining 2 or 3 days of life behaving as inappropriately as she could. She had begun by slapping an old man in the face. She had burst into tears in front of a nurse. She had refused to be nice and to talk to the others when really wanted was to be alone. And now she was free enough to feel hatred, although intelligent enough not to smash everything around her and risk spending what remained of her life under sedation and in a bed in a ward. At that moment, she hated everything: herself, the world, the chair in front of her, the broken radiator in one of the corridors, people who were perfect criminals. She was in a mental hospital, and so she could allow herself to feel things that people usually hide. We are all brought up only to love, to accept, to look for ways around things, to avoid conflict. Veronica hated everything, but mainly she hated the way she had lived her life. never bothering to discover the hundreds of other Veronicas who lived inside her and who were interesting, crazy, curious, brave, bold. Then she started to feel hatred for the person. She started to feel hatred for the person she loved most in the world, her mother. A wonderful wife who worked all day and washed the dishes at night, sacrificing her own life so that the daughter would have a good education, know how to play the piano and the violin, dress like a princess, have the latest sneakers and jeans, while she mended the same old dress she had worn for years. How can I hate someone who only ever gave me love? Thought Veronica, confused, trying to check her feelings. But it was too late. Her hatred had been unleashed. She had opened the door to her personal hell. She hated the love she had been given because it had asked for nothing in return, which was absurd, unreal, against the law of nature. That love asking for nothing in return had managed to fill her with guilt, with a desire to fulfill another's expectations, even if that meant giving up everything she had dreamed of for herself. It was a love that for years had tried to hide from her the difficulties and the corruption that existed in the world, ignoring the fact that one day she would have to find this out and would then be defenseless against them. And her father? She hated her father too, because unlike her mother, who worked all the time, he knew how to live. He took her to bars and to the theaters. They had fun together, and when he was still young, she had loved him secretly, not the way one loves a father, but as a man. She hated him because he had always been so charming and so open with everyone except her mother, the only person who really deserved such treatment. She hated everything: the library with its piles of books full of explanation about life, the school that had forced her to spend whole evenings learning algebra, even though she didn't know a single person apart from teachers and mathematicians who needed algebra in order to be happy. Why did they make them learn so much algebra or geometry or any of that mountain of other useless things? Veronica pushed open the door to the living room, went over to the piano and opened the lid, and summoning up all her strength, pounded on the keys. A mad, cacophonous, jangled chord echoed around the empty room, bounced off the walls, and returned to her in the guise of a shrill sound that seemed to tear at her soul. Yet it was an accurate portrait of her soul at that moment. She pounded on the keys again and again. The dissonant notes reverberated around her. I'm crazy. I'm allowed to do this. I can hate. I can pound away at the piano. Since when have mental patients known how to play notes in the right order? She pounded the piano again, once, twice, 10, 20 times, and each time she did it, her hatred seemed to diminish until it vanished completely. Then once more a deep peace flooded through her head, and Veronica again looked out at the starry sky and at the new moon, her favorite, filling the room she was in with gentle light. The impression returned of infinity and eternity walking hand in hand. You only had to look for one of them, for example, the limitless universe, to feel the presence of the other. Time that never ends, that never passes, that remains in the present, where all of the life secrets lie. As she had been walking from the ward to that room, she had felt such pure hatred that now she had no more rancor left in her heart. She had finally allowed her negative feelings to surface, feelings that had been repressed for years in her soul. She had actually felt them, and they were no longer necessary. They could leave. She sat on in silence, enjoying the present moment, letting love fill up the empty space left behind by hatred. When she felt the moment had come, she turned to the moon and played a sonata in homage to it, knowing that the moon was listening and would feel proud, and that this would provoke the jealousy of the stars. Then she played music for the stars, for the garden, for the mountains she could not see in the darkness, but which she knew was there. While she was playing that music for the garden, another crazy person appeared. Edouard, a schizophrenic who was beyond all cure. She was not frightened by his presence. On the contrary, she smiled, and to her surprise, he smiled back. The music could penetrate even his remote world, more distant than the moon itself. It could even perform miracles. I must buy a new keyring, thought Dr. Igor as he opened the door to his small consulting room in Villette. The old one was falling to pieces, and a small decorative metal shield had just fallen to the floor. Dr. Igor bent down and picked it up. What should he do with that shield bearing the Jubalajana coat of arms? He might as well throw it away, although he could have it mended and ask them to make a new leather strap, or else he could give it to his nephew to play with. Both alternatives seemed quite equally absurd. A keyring doesn't cost very much, and his nephew had no interest in shields. He spent all his time watching television or playing with electronic toys imported from Italy. Dr. Igor could still not bring himself to throw it out. However, so he put it back into his pocket. He would decide what to do with it later on. That was why he was the director of the hospital and not a patient, because he thought a lot before making any decision. He turned on the light. As winter advanced, dawn came even later, ever later. Dislocation, divorce, and the absence of light were the main reasons for the increasing number of cases of depression. Dr. Igor was hoping that spring would arrive early and solve half his problems. He looked at his diary for the day. He needed to find some way to prevent Edward from dying of hunger. His schizophrenia made him unpredictable, and now he had stopped eating. Dr. Igor had already prescribed intravenous feeding, but he couldn't keep that up forever. Edward was a strong young man of 28, but even with an IV drip, he would eventually waste away, becoming more and more skeletal. What would Edward's father think? He was one of the young Slovene Republic's best known ambassadors. He had been one of the people behind the delicate negotiations with Yugoslavia in the early 1990s. He, after all, had managed to work for years for the Belgrade government, surviving his detractors who accused him of working for the enemy, and he was still in the diplomatic corps, except this time he represented a different country. He was a powerful and influential man, feared by everyone. Dr. Igor felt momentarily worried, just as before he had been worried about the shield on his keyring. But he immediately dismissed the thought. As far as the ambassador was concerned, it didn't matter whether his son looked well or not. He had no intention of taking him to official functions or having Edward accompany him to the various places in the world where was sent as a government representative. Edward was in Villette, and there we would stay forever, or at least as long as his father continued earning his nice fat salary. Dr. Igor decided to stop the intravenous feeding and allow Edward to waste away a little more until he felt like eating again. If the situation got worse, he would write a report and pass responsibility on to the Council of Doctors who administered Villette. The best way to avoid trouble is to share responsibility, his father had taught him. He had been a doctor too, and although he had had various deaths on his hand, he had never had any problem with the authorities. Once Dr. Igor had ordered Edward's treatment to stop, he moved on to the next case. According to the report, Zetka Mendel had completed her course of treatment and could be allowed to leave. Dr. Igor wanted to see for himself. There was nothing a doctor dreaded more than getting complaints for the families of patients who had been in Villette, which was what nearly always happened, for it was rare for a patient to readjust successfully to normal life after a period spent in a mental hospital. It wasn't the fault of the hospital or of any of the hospitals scattered around the world. The problem of readjustment was exactly the same everywhere. Just as prison never corrects the prisoner, it only teaches him to commit more crime. So hospitals merely got patients used to a completely unreal world where everything was allowed and where no one had to take responsibility for their actions. There was only one way out to discover a cure for insanity, and Dr. Igor had engaged his heart and soul in just that, developing a thesis that would revolutionize the psychiatric world. In mental hospitals, temporary patients who lived alongside incurable patients began a process of social degeneration that, once started, was impossible to stop. Zetka Mendel would come back to the hospital eventually, and this time of her own volition, complaining of non existent ailments simply in order to be close to people who seemed to understand her better than those in the outside world. If, however, he could find a way of combating vitriol, the poison which Dr. Igor believed to be the cause of insanity, his name would go down in history and people would finally know where Slovenia was. That week, he had been given a heaven sent opportunity in the shape of a would be suicide. He was not going to lose this opportunity for all the money in the world. Dr. Igor felt happy. Although he was obliged for economic reasons to accept treatments like insulin shock, for example, that had long ago been condemned by the medical professions, the same economic reasons lay behind Villette's instigation of a new psychiatric treatment. As well as having the time and the staff to carry out his researches in vitriol, He also had the honor's permission to allow the group calling itself the fraternity to remain in the hospital. The shareholders in the institution tolerated, note that word well, not encouraged but tolerated, a longer period of internment than was strictly necessary. They argued that for humanitarian reasons, they should give the recently cured the option of deciding for themselves when would be the best moment for them to rejoin the world. And that had led to a group of people deciding to stay in Villette as if at a select hospital or a club for those with similar interests and views. Thus, Dr. Igor managed to keep the insane and the sane in the same place, allowing the latter to have a positive influence on the former. To prevent things from degenerating and to stop the insane having a negative effect on those who had been cured, every member of the fraternity had to leave the hospital at least once a day. Dr. Igor knew that the reasons given by the shareholders for allowing the presence of healthy people in the hospital, humanitarian reasons, they said, were just an excuse. They were afraid that Ljubljana, Slovenia's small but charming capital, did not have a sufficient number of wealthy, crazy people to sustain this expensive modern building. Besides, the public health system ran a number of first class mental hospitals of its own, and that left Villette at a disadvantage in the mental health market. When the shareholders had converted the old barracks into a hospital, their target market had been the men and women likely to be affected by the war with Yugoslavia. The war, however, had been brief. The shareholders had felt certain that war would return, but it didn't. Moreover, recent research had shown that while wars did have their psychological victims, they were far fewer than, say, the victims of stress, tedium, congenital illness, loneliness, and rejection. When a community had a major problem to face, for example, war, hypertension, hyperinflation, or plague, there was a slight increase in the number of suicides but a marked decline in cases of depression, paranoia, and psychosis. These returned to their normal levels as soon as that problem had become been overcome, indicating or so to Dr. Ig- so di- indicating or so Dr. Igor thought that people only allow themselves the luxury of being insane when they are in a position to do so. He had before him another recent survey, this time for Canada. The country, an American newspaper, had recently voted to have the highest standard of living. Dr. Igor read, according to Statistics Canada, 40% of people between 15 and 34, 33% of people between 35 and 54, and 20% of people between 55 and 64 have already had some kind of mental illnesses. It is thought that one in every five individuals suffers from some form of psychiatric disorder, and one in every eight Canadians will be hospitalized at least once in their lifetime because of mental disturbances. They have got a bigger market there than we have, he thought. The happier people can be, the unhappier they are. Dr. Igor analyzed a few more cases, thinking carefully about those he should share with the council and those he should resolve alone. By the time he had finished, day had broken, and he turned off the light. He immediately ordered his first appointment to be shown in, the mother of the patient who had tried to commit suicide. I'm Veronica's mother. How is my daughter? Dr. Igor wondered if he should tell her the truth and save her any unpleasant surprises. After all, he had a daughter with the same name, but he decided it was best to say nothing. We don't know yet, he lied. We need another week. I have no idea why Veronica did it, said the woman tearfully. We have always been loving parents. We sacrificed everything to give her the best possible upbringing. Although my husband and I have had our ups and downs, we have kept the family together. As an example of perseverance in adversity, she's got a good job, she's nice looking, and yet she tried to kill herself, said Dr. Igor. There's no reason to be surprised. That's the way it is. People just can't cope with happiness. If you like, I could show you the statistics for Canada. Canada? The woman seemed startled. Dr. Igor saw that he had managed to distract her and went on. Look, you haven't come here to find out how your daughter is, but to apologize for the fact that she tried to commit suicide. How old is she? 24. So she is mature, experienced woman who knows what she wants and is perfectly capable of making her own choices. What has that got to do with your marriage or with the sacrifices that you and your husband made? How long has she lived on her own? 6 years. You see, she's fundamentally independent, but because of what a certain Austrian doctor, Dr. Sigmund Freud, I'm sure you have heard of him, wrote about unhealthy relationships between parents and children, people today still blame themselves for everything. Do you imagine that Indians believe that the son turned murderer is a victim of his parents' upbringing? Tell me. I haven't the faintest idea, replied the woman, who couldn't get over her bewilderment at the doctor's behavior. Perhaps he was influenced by his patients. Well, I'll tell you, said Dr. Igor. The Indians believe the murderer to be guilty, not society, not his parents, not his ancestors. Do the Japanese commit suicide because a son of theirs decided to take drugs and go out and shoot people? The reply is the same, no. And as we all know, the Japanese will commit suicide at the drop of a hat. The other day I read that a young Japanese man killed himself because he had failed his university entrance exams. Do you think I could talk to my daughter? Asked the woman, who was not interested in the Japanese, the Indians, or the Canadians. Yes, yes, in a moment, said Dr. Igor, slightly annoyed by the interruption. But first, I want you to understand one thing. Apart from certain grave pathological cases, people only go insane when they try to escape from routine. Do you understand? I do, she replied. And if you think that I won't be capable of looking after her, you can rest assured. I have never tried to change my life. Good. Dr. Igor seemed relieved. Can you imagine a world in which, for example, we were not obliged to repeat the same thing every day of our lives? If, for example, we all decided to eat only when we were hungry, what would housewives and restaurants do? It would be more normal to eat only when we were hungry, thought the woman, but she said nothing, afraid that he might not let her speak to Veronica. Well, it would cause tremendous confusion, she said at last. I'm a housewife myself and I know what I'm talking about. So we have breakfast, lunch, and supper. We have to wake up at a certain hour every day and rest once a week. Christmas exists so that we can give each other presents. Easter so that we can spend a few days at the lake. How would you like it if your husband were gripped by a sudden passionate impulse and decided he wanted to make love in the living room? The woman thought, what is the man talking about? I came here to see my daughter. I would find it very sad, she said carefully, hoping she was giving the right answer. Excellent, roared Dr. Igor. The bedroom is the correct place for making love. To make love anywhere else would set a bad example and promote the spread of anarchy. Can I see my daughter? Said the woman. Dr. Igor gave up. This peasant would never understand what he was talking about. She wasn't interested in discussing insanity from a philosophical point of view, even though she knew her daughter had made a serious suicide attempt and had been in coma. He rang the bell and his secretary appeared. Call the young woman who tried to commit suicide, he said. The one who wrote the letter to the newspaper saying that she was killing herself in order to put Slovenia on the map. I don't want to see her. I've cut all my links with the outside world. It had been hard to say that in the lounge with everyone else there, but the nurse hadn't been exactly discreet either, and had announced in a loud voice that her mother was waiting to see her, as if it were a matter of general interest. She didn't want to see her mother. It would only upset both of them. It was best that her mother should think of her as dead. Veronica had always hated goodbyes. The man disappeared when he had come, and she went back to looking at the mountains. After a week, the sun had finally returned, something she had known what would happen the previous night because the moon had told her while she was playing the piano. No, that's crazy. I'm losing my grip. Planets don't talk, or only to self styled astrologers. If the moon spoke to anyone, it was to that schizophrenic. The very moment she thought this, she noticed a sharp pain in her chest, and her arms went numb. Veronica felt her head spinning. A heart attack. She entered a kind of euphoric state as if death had freed her from the fear of dying, so it was all over. She might still experience some pain, but what were 5 minutes of agony in exchange for an eternity of peace? The only possible response was to close her eyes. In the films, the things she most hated to see were dead people with staring eyes. But the heart attack was different from what she had imagined. Her breathing became labored, and Veronica was horrified to realize that she was about to experience the worst of her fears suffocation. She was going to die as if she were being buried alive or had suddenly been plunged into the depths of the sea. She stumbled, fell, felt a sharp blow on her face, continued making heroic efforts to breathe, but the air wouldn't go in. Worst of all, death did not come. She was entirely conscious of what was going on around her. She could still see colors and shapes, although she had difficulty hearing what others were saying. The cries and exclamations seemed distant, as if coming from another world. Apart from this, everything else was real. The air wouldn't enter her lungs. It would simply not obey the commands of her lungs and her muscles. And still, she did not lose consciousness. She felt someone touch her and turn her over, but now she had lost control of her eye movements and her eyes were flickering wildly, sending hundreds of different images to her brain, combining the feeling of suffocation with a sense of complete visual confusion. After a while, the images became distant too, and just when the agony reached its peak, the air finally rushed into her lungs, making a tremendous noise that left everyone in the room paralyzed with fear. Veronica began to vomit copiously. Once the near tragedy had passed, some of the crazy people there began to laugh, and she felt humiliated, lost, paralyzed. A nurse came running in and gave her an injection in the arm. It's all right, calm down. It's over now. I didn't die. She started shouting, crawling towards the other patient, smearing the floor and the furniture with her vomit. I'm still in this damn hospital, forced to live with you people, living 1,000 deaths every day, every night, and not one of you feels an ounce of pity for me? She turned on the nurse, grabbing her syringe from his hand and threw it into the garden. And what do you want? Why don't you just inject me with poison since I'm already condemned to die? How can you be so heartless? Unable to control herself any longer, she sat down on the floor again and started crying uncontrollably, shouting, sobbing loudly while some of the other patients laughed and made remarks about her filthy clothes. Give her a sedative, said a doctor, hurrying in. Get the situation under control. The nurses, however, was frozen to the spot. The doctor went out again and returned with two more male nurses and another syringe. The men grabbed the hysterical girl, struggling in the middle of the room, while the doctor injected the last drop of sedative into a vein in her vomit smeared arm. She was in Dr. Igor's consulting room, lying on an immaculate white bed with clean sheets on it. He was listening to her heart. She was pretending that she was still asleep, but something inside her must have changed, judging by the doctor's muttered words. Don't you worry. In your state of health, you could live to be 100. Veronica opened her eyes. Someone had taken her clothes off. Who? Dr. Igor? Did that mean he had seen her naked? Her brain wasn't working properly. What did you say? I said not to worry. No, you said I could live to be 100? The doctor went over to his desk. You said I could live to be 100, Veronica repeated. Nothing is certain in medicine, said Dr. Igor, trying to cover up. Everything is possible. How is my heart? The same. She didn't need to hear anymore. When faced with a serious case, doctor always say, you will live to be 100, or there's nothing seriously wrong with you, or you have the heart and blood pressure of a young girl, or even we need to redo the test. They're probably afraid the patient will go berserk in the consulting room. She tried to get up but couldn't. The whole room started to spin. Just lie down a bit longer until you feel better. You are not bothering me. Oh, good, thought Veronica. But what if I were? Being an experienced physician, Dr. Igor remained silent for some time, pretending to read the papers on his desk. When we are with other people and they say nothing, the situation becomes irritating, tense, unbearable. Dr. Igor was hoping that the girl would start talking so that he could collect more data for his thesis on insanity and the cure he was developing. But Veronica didn't say a word. She may still be suffering from a high level of vitriol poisoning, thought Dr. Igor, and decided to break the silence, which was becoming tense, irritating, unbearable. So you like to play piano? He said, trying to sound as nonchalant as possible. And the lunatics enjoy it too. Yesterday there was a guy listening who was utterly transfixed. Yes, Edward. He mentioned to someone how much he had enjoyed it. Who knows, he might start eating normally again. A schizophrenic liking music? And he mentioned it to someone else? Yes, and I imagine you have no idea what you are talking about. That doctor who looked more like a patient with his dyed black hair was right. Veronica had often heard the word schizophrenic, but she had no idea what it meant. Is there a cure then? She asked, hoping to find out more about schizophrenic. It can be controlled. We still don't really know what goes on in the world of insanity. Everything is still so new, and the treatments change every decade or so. A schizophrenic is a person who already has a natural tendency to absent his mind from his world until some factor, something serious, sometimes superficial, depending on the individual circumstances, forces him to create his own reality. It can develop into a state of complete alienation, what we call catatonia, but people do occasionally recover, at least enough to allow the patient to work and lead a near normal life. It all depends on one thing: environment. You say they create their own reality, said Veronica. But what is reality? It's whatever the majority deems it to be. It's not necessarily the best or the most logical, but it's the one that supports the desires of society as a whole. You see this thing I've got around my neck? You mean your tie? Exactly. Your answer is logical, coherent, answer as an absolutely normal person would give. It's a tie. A lunatic, however, would say that what I have round my neck is a ridiculous, useless bit of colored cloth, tied in a very complicated way, which makes it harder to get air into your lungs and difficult to turn your neck. I have to be careful when I'm anywhere near a fan, or I can be strangled by this bit of cloth. If a lunatic were to ask me what this tie is for, I would have to say absolutely nothing. It's not even purely decorative, since nowadays it's become a symbol of slavery, power, aloofness. The only really useful function a tie serves is the sense of relief when you get home and take it off. You feel as if you have freed yourself from something, though quite what you don't know. But does that sense of relief justify the existence of ties? No. Nevertheless, if I were to ask a madman and a normal man what this is, the same person would say a tie. It doesn't matter who's correct. What matters is who's right. So just because I gave the right name to a bit of colored cloth, you conclude that I'm not mad. No, you are mad, though. No, you are not mad, thought Dr. Igor, who was an authority on the subject, with various diplomas hanging on the walls of his consulting room, attempting to take your own life was something proper to a human being. He knew a lot of people who were doing just that, and yet they lived outside the hospital, feigning innocence and normality, merely because they had chosen the scandalous route of suicide. They were killing themselves gradually, poisoning themselves with what Igor called vitriol. Vitriol was a toxic substance whose symptoms he had identified in his conversations with the men and women he had met. Now he was writing a thesis on the subject, which he would submit to the Slovenian Academy of Sciences for its scrutiny. It was the most important steps in the field of insanity, since Dr. Pinel had ordered that patients should be unshackled, astonishing the medical world with the idea that some of them might even be cured. As with the libido, the chemical reaction responsible for sexual desire, which Dr. Freud had identified but which no laboratory had even managed to isolate, vitriol was released by the human organism whenever a person found him or herself in a frightening situation, although it had yet to be picked up in any spectrographic spectrographic test. It was easily recognized, though, by its taste, which was neither sweet or savory, a bitter taste. Dr. Igor, the as yet unrecognized discoverer of this fatal substance, had given it the name of a poison which favored in the past by emperors, kings, and lovers of all kind whenever they needed to rid themselves of some obstructive person. A golden age, the age of the kings and emperors when you could live and die romantically. The murderer would invite his or her victim to partake of a magnificent supper. The servant would pour them drinks served in two exquisite glasses, and one of the drinks would be laced with vitriol. Imagine the excitement aroused by each gesture the victim made, picking up the glass, saying a few tender or aggressive words, drinking as if the glass contained some delicious beverage, giving his host his one last startled look, then falling to the floor. But this poison, which was now very expensive and difficult to obtain, had been replaced by more reliable methods of exterminations, revolvers, bacteria, and so on. Dr. Igor, a natural romantic, had rescued this name from obscurity and given it to the disease of the soul he had managed to diagnose, and whose discovery would soon astonish the world. It was odd that no one had ever discovered vitriol as a mortal poison, although most of the people affected could identify its taste and they referred to the process of poisoning as bitterness. To a greater or lesser degree, everyone had some bitterness in their organism, just as we are all carrier of these tuberculosis bacillus. But these two illnesses only attack when the patient is debilitated. In the case of bitterness, the right conditions for the disease occur when the person becomes afraid of so called reality. Certain people, in their eagerness to construct a world no external threat can penetrate, build exaggeratedly high defenses against the outside world, against new people, new places, different experiences, and leave their inner world stripped bare. It is there that bitterness begins its irrevocable work. The will was the main target of bitterness, or vitriol, as Dr. Igor preferred to call it. The people attacked by this malaise began to lose all desire, and within a few years, they become They became unable to leave their world, where they had spent enormous reserves of energy constructing high walls in order to make reality what they wanted it to be. In order to avoid external attack, they had also deliberately limited internal growth. They continued going to work, watching television, having children, complaining about the traffic, but these things happened automatically, unaccompanied by any particular emotion, because after all, everything was under control. The great problem with poisoning by bitterness was that the poisons, hatred, love, despair, enthusiasm, curiosity, also ceased to manifest themselves. After a while, the embittered person felt no desire at all. He or she lacked the will either to live or to die. That was the problem. That is why embittered people find heroes and madmen a perennial source of fascination, for they have no fear of life or death. Both heroes and madmen are indifferent to danger and will forge ahead regardless of what other people say. The madman committed suicide, the hero offered himself up to martyrdom in the name of a cause, but both would die, and embittered would spend many nights in rays remarking on the absurdity and glory of both. It was the it was the only moment when the embittered person had the energy to clamber up his defensive wall and peer over the world outside, but then his hands and feet would grow tired and he would return to daily life. The chronically embittered person only noticed his illnesses once a week on Sunday afternoons. Then, with no work or routine to relieve the symptoms, he would feel that something was very wrong, since he found the peace for those endless afternoons infernal and felt only a keen sense of constant irritation. Monday would arrive, however, and the embittered man would immediately forget his symptoms, although he would curse the fact that he never had time to rest and would complain that the weekends always passed far too quickly. From the social point of view, the only advantage of the disease was that it had become the norm, and internment was no longer necessary except in cases where the poisoning was too severe. The patient's behavior began to affect others. The poisoning was so severe that the patient's behavior began to affect others. Most embittered people, though, could continue to live outside, constituting no threat to society or to others, since because of the high walls with which they had surrounded themselves, totally isolated them from the world, even though they appear to participate in it. Dr. Sigmund Freud had discovered the libido and a cure for the problems it caused, in the form of psychoanalysis. Apart from discovering the existence of vitriol, Dr. Igor needed to prove that a cure for it was also possible. He wanted to leave his mark on the history of medicine, although he had no illusions about the difficulties he would face when it came to publishing his ideas, for normal people were content with their lives and he would never admit to the existence of such illness, while the sick fed a gigantic industry of mental hospital, laboratories, conferences, and so on. I know the world will not recognize my efforts, he said to himself, proud of being misunderstood. After all, that was the price every genius had to pay. Is anything wrong, doctor? Asked the girl. You seem to have drifted off into the world of your patients. Dr. Igor ignored the disrespectful comment. You can go now, he said. That brings us to the end. Um, I think we will end the stream here. We will continue from chapter, not, I don't know which chapter, but yeah, page number 93 tomorrow in the next reading. If you have any comments, any questions, any recommendations, any feedback, you can reach out in the comment section of the video you're viewing or in the community section of YouTube channel. Bye bye for now. If you have not subscribed yet, do subscribe, like and share if you like the video. Bye bye, take care, keep reading.